You are lucky. You live in a world blessed by science. We have mind-blowing technology today that the ancients couldn't even fathom. Our modern technology would not have come about without the progress made in modern science. But how did we get to this point? What led to the development of science, which in turn has created an advanced age that has made the world better for everyone? There are many factors that contributed to science, like Greek philosophy, advances made in the Islamic and Hindu worlds, and economic necessity. But modern science as we know it came about through the Christian West for a reason. Although there were other factors that contributed to science, Christianity was crucial for its development, if not the most crucial aspect. This is the story of how Christianity created modern science. A common myth today is that Christianity not only didn't help advance science, it actually held it back. This graphic is often spread around, which purports to claim that science was advancing. But then the Christian Dark Ages reversed scientific progress and sent us back thousands of years. Then the Renaissance and the Enlightenment freed us and brought us into the modern era. But this is pure mythology. First off, scientific advancement cannot be measured in a linear fashion because there are various areas of science that can develop independently. A culture could make advances in astronomy, but lack advances in medicine, or vice versa. But more importantly, the concept of the Dark Ages, defined as a 1,000-year period when Christian Europe lost all scientific knowledge and Christians actively worked to eradicate it, is a modern myth. Larissa Grolleman says, "As a medievalist, I'm asked all the time, why was it called the Dark Ages? This phrase comes up a few times in history, and it means something different every time. Dark Ages usually refers to the 900 years of European history between the 5th and 14th centuries. Have you heard that this was a period of stalled advancements in science or culture? That's just a myth. During this period, advances in science were being made. If any time was dark or had slow progress, it was the early Middle Ages, from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire to the Carthaginian era. But this had nothing to do with Christianity, and we can still find advancements made in this period. As we noted in a recent video, how Christianity educated the world, the Church Fathers encouraged the study of the Greek classics. There was no effort to alter the school curriculum by removing the classical authors. Church Fathers routinely engage with non-Christian authors and build on them. Admanye Baki says, "The leading theologians in the Eastern tradition, from the beginning of the 3rd century to the close of the 5th, all held that the Greek classics, which were the staple of the encyclical studies, contained elements valuable to Christians. The same is true of Western fathers, such as Jerome and Augustine." Speaking of Augustine, James Ungariano and David Hutchings highlighted an interesting section in his writings. Augustine wasn't a scientist, but he also wasn't against empirical curiosity. He heard a rumor that peacock meat would not go moldy. Instead of merely believing this, Augustine decided to conduct an experiment. This property, when I first heard of it, seemed to me incredible, but it happened at Carthage that a bird of this kind was cooked and served up to me, and taking a suitable slice of the flesh from its breast, I ordered it to be kept. And when it had been kept as many days as make any other flesh stinking, it was produced and set before me, and emitted no offensive smell. And after it had been laid by for 30 days and more, it was still in the same state, and a year after, the same still, except it was a little more shriveled and drier. Any biologist, chemist, or physicist worth their salt would immediately recognize the passage above for precisely what it is: a fully fledged and surprisingly modern science experiment. Many popular histories of science suggest that experiments of this form only first appeared in the 1600s with the likes of Galileo and Boyle and Hooke. Yet here we are at around AD 420, and Augustine has beaten the lot of them to it. He has a hypothesis, he has a method, he has data, he has a conclusion. By referencing other meats, he even built in a control variable of sorts. Augustine was not alone in his methods and thinking. In the West, Boethius developed on Greek philosophy and physics. He made advances in the study of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. In the East, John Philoponus made advances in philosophy, physics, and cosmology. He proposed a theory that a moving object receives an internal impetus from an initial force, which keeps it in motion until dissipated. His idea is similar to later work on medieval impetus theory and Newton's first law of motion. Philoponus also didn't take Aristotle's word that a heavier object would fall faster than a lighter one. In fact, he wrote, "If you let fall from the same heights two weights, one of which is many times heavier than the other, you will see that the relative times required for their drop does not depend on their relative weights, but that the difference in the time taken is very small." The historian James Hannam comments on this. In this passage, Philoponus is clearly referring to an experiment that he has tried himself. A modern myth is that this idea was not figured out until Galileo, but here we have John Philoponus demonstrating this fact a millennium prior. In Britain, the Venerable Bede focused on the study of history, time, astronomy, and cosmology. Alan Chapman refers to him as Britain's first astronomer of international standing. Additionally, Bede wondered why the sea was salty if it was fed by fresh water from rivers. The ancient author Pliny the Elder said the reason for the difference was there were tunnels under the sea which carried fresh water back to the heads of rivers. Bede was unconvinced by this, and through empirical investigation, came to the conclusion fresh waters flow above salt waters, for they are lighter, the latter certainly, being of a heavier nature, better sustain the waters poured over them. In other words, he investigated the issue and found that fresh water could not be returning through underground tunnels because of its weight. In the East, Leo the mathematician focused on mathematics, Aristotelian logic, astronomy, medicine, and philology. He also wrote his own medical treatise, and his school developed a smaller script, which was more useful for copying and preserving texts. Gerbert of Aurillac, a mathematician and astronomer, became Pope Sylvester II in the year 999. He helped to introduce Arabic numerals to the West and gave instructions on how to make astronomical apparatuses. If the Church was holding back science, why were men of science being elevated to high positions? Throughout antiquity and the early Middle Ages, men of science were making progress, and there is no evidence the Church was standing against them. Monasteries became centers of learning that had extensive libraries, which preserved many classical works. More importantly, Europeans made advances in agricultural technology, which led to an increase in food supply and a larger population. James Hannam says, "In Europe as a whole, the population increased from less than 20 million to almost 75 million. These figures are of course estimates, if not guesstimates, but the upward trend is clear. For comparison, at the height of the Roman Empire, about 33 million people lived in Europe, well before 1000 AD. The population far exceeded what it was when the continent had been ruled by Rome, and remained above that level even after the Black Death had killed a third of the inhabitants of Europe in the 14th century. The early Middle Ages were not without their problems. This had more to do with external factors than anything caused by Christianity. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the invasion of Germanic tribes did create a lack of centralization, which slowed progress. Shortly after, there were Viking and Muslim invasions into Western Europe, which also slowed progress. The new Islamic world cut the Mediterranean world in half and disrupted traditional trading. Because of these factors and others, many classical works were lost in the West. However, around the turn of the millennium, they were able to regain many of them, and the second half of the Middle Ages saw substantial growth and advances in science. Europeans created a new institution, the independent university. Centers of learning existed before Christianity, but in the Middle Ages, universities were created that had their own governing board. This new type of institution was free to pursue its own interests. Toby E. Huff compared European universities with the Islamic madrasa. From a structural and legal point of view, the madrasa and the university were contrasting types. Whereas the madrasa was a pious endowment under the law of religious and charitable holdings, with its property set aside as a sacred and inviolable trust. The universities of Europe were legally autonomous corporate entities that had many legal rights and privileges. This included the capacity to make their own internal rules and regulations, the right to buy and sell property, to have legal representation forums, to make contracts, to sue and be sued, and not the least of all, the right to change the curriculum. Universities began to spring up all over Europe, and advances were made in the study of medicine, astronomy, optics, and several other fields. To give some examples, Albertus Magnus wrote 2 important books among many others. These were the first medieval European attempts to systematically describe and classify animals, plants, and minerals. He drew on Aristotle, but also his own observations. He is also credited with laying the groundwork for what would become modern chemistry. Magnus earned the nickname of Universal Teacher, given that he wrote on a wide range of subjects from geometry to medicine, logic to falconry. Robert Grosseteste studied optics, astronomy, mathematics, and the philosophy of science. He argued the universe could not be eternal, and it was created using light. Seb Falk says, Grosseteste's brief but visionary treatise on light described an explosion of light at the beginning of time, oddly reminiscent of the Big Bang. In his study of light, he noted that rainbows resulted from refraction of light through water droplets, laying groundwork for later optical developments. He also argued that mathematics was fundamental to all nature, and that it could be used to quantify and analyze natural phenomena. Roger Bacon followed in Grosseteste's footsteps and made advances in astronomy, optics, and mathematics. He emphasized the importance of observation and verification of results through experimentation. His study of light and lenses helped to pave the way for telescopes and magnifying glasses. He also hypothesized how flying machines and underwater vessels could work long before the modern era. Throughout the Middle Ages, various inventions were produced, such as blast furnaces, mechanical clocks, astronomical clocks, windmills, eyeglasses, gantry cranes, rolling mills, stern rudders, horizontal looms, corn gunpowder, compound curved plate armor, and magnets. What Europeans didn't outright invent, they took from other cultures and improved on them. There is simply too much history to cover in this video, but a point made by Seb Falk should be highlighted. If anything, this period was not a dark ages. The medieval reality, however, is a light age of scientific interest and inquiry. Michael Schenck says, the crude concept of the Middle Ages as a millennia of stagnation brought on by Christianity has largely disappeared among scholars familiar with the period, but it remains vigorous among popularizers of history of science. Unguriado and Hutchings say, it seems that the Dark Ages were not all that dark after all. It becomes clear that medieval intellectuals were not only rational, they were hyper-rational. To them, logic was the single most important tool for the investigation of the natural world. But how do we not know these advances were made in spite of Christianity? In other words, what is the evidence that Christianity was crucial for the development of science and was not merely associated with its rise? Historians have highlighted several aspects of Christian doctrines that were borrowed into scientific methodology and helped to make it what it is today. Noah J. Efron highlights how Christianity was not the only factor that gave rise to modern science. But he also says, generations of historians and sociologists have discovered many ways in which Christians, Christian beliefs, and Christian institutions played crucial roles in fashioning the tenets, methods, and institutions of what in time became modern science. Today, almost all historians agree that Christianity, Catholicism, as well as Protestantism, moved many early modern intellectuals to study nature systematically. Historians have also found that notions borrowed from Christian belief found their way into scientific discourse with glorious results. The very notion that nature is lawful, some scholars argue, was borrowed from Christian theology. To begin, Christians held to monotheism, the belief in one God. In contrast, the ancient pagans believed in many gods, who were believed to fight with one another. Cultures that believe the world is governed by many gods tend to think of the world as unpredictable and chaotic, and as a product of supernatural chaos. But in Christianity, there is one God who controls all and creates all out of his good will. No one can challenge him or change his laws. This leads to the belief that we can expect consistency and regularity in the world we study through science. Hutchings and Ungariano say, monotheism gave rise to one of the cornerstones of modern science, the belief that an experiment conducted on Monday will give results that are still usable on a Tuesday, since the same God is in total charge of his universe. But it was not just monotheism that helped give rise to science, but the type of monotheistic creator is also important. In some religions, the creator can be unpredictable and chaotic. In Islam, Allah is said to be the best of deceivers, and he can go back on his promises. But in Judaism and Christianity, God keeps the covenants he establishes. His word is binding. In Genesis 8 and 9, God establishes an everlasting covenant with nature. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. But also in Deuteronomy we read, know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenants and steadfast love, and those who love him keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. In the New Testament, Jesus said heaven and earth will pass away, but my words shall not pass away. There are several passages like this, which say God will not break his covenants. Given that God established a covenant with nature, Christians can trust that natural regularity will continue, since God's word is binding. St. Bonaventure once said, faith moves us to believe that the three periods of law, namely that of natural law, of the scripture, and of grace, follow each other in the most harmonious order. From this, we can expect that God's laws today will be the same tomorrow, and thus we can be confident the laws of nature will always be the same, which is crucial for scientific methodology. Additionally, Christian researchers extrapolated from passages like 1 Corinthians 14:33 that God is not an author of confusion. We also see in Matthew 6, Jesus instructs his disciples to use their reason. If God will feed the birds and clothe the grass, then it reasonably follows that he will take care of humans, whom he loves more. In other words, he is a rational creator, and therefore, we can expect that what he creates will be rational as well. Johannes Kepler said, the world is the perfection of God's works, that they are all done with the greatest simplicity. He is the God of order and not of confusion. This leads to the idea that nature is rational, and that it can be studied in a rational and consistent way. Hutchings and Ungariano say, for if nature is God's handiwork, and if God is reasonable, then his universe should be reasonable too. And reasonable universes, of course, are both easier and more enjoyable to study. James Hannam says, nature obeys the laws that God ordained when he created the world. These natural laws are the secondary causes that God usually employs, although the precise term natural law and law of nature were not used in this sense during the Middle Ages. Thus, by investigating natural causes, the philosopher does not threaten God's omnipotence in any way. Next, we see that Christianity, instead of limiting science with dogma, came with dogma that freed science from old limits. In 1277, the Bishop of Paris banned some of the teachings of Aristotle, which on the surface makes it sound like the church was opposed to science. But Edward Grant notes the reasoning behind the ban suggests the opposite. The most significant aspect of the condemnation of 1277 was not the condemnation of Aristotle's offensive ideas about Christian doctrine, but rather the condemnation of his ideas that seemed to limit God's absolute power to do whatever he pleased, short of a logical contradiction. They firmly believed that for God, Aristotle's natural impossibilities were all supernaturally possible. In other words, Aristotle was too dogmatic on certain things that he believed the Creator could or could not do. Christians were more open-minded because they believed in an omnipotent God who could do anything logical. When we look at what they banned in Aristotle, it reveals that they were concerned with ways Aristotle would limit scientific investigation. Some examples are that the first cause could not make several worlds, that God cannot be the cause of a new act, nor can he produce something anew, that God could not move the heavens with a rectilinear motion, and the reason is that a vacuum would remain. The clergy felt these ideas about God would limit scientific investigation, so Christian beliefs came with fewer constraints than what we find in Aristotle, and allowed researchers to study and explore more than what the Greeks thought was possible. Of course, the ban in Paris didn't last, and many Christians, like Thomas Aquinas, found ways to rectify Christian doctrine with Aristotle. So the ban wasn't because Aristotle was a threat to Christian dogma, but because he put limits on God. We also see medieval Christians were not so dogmatic in how they understood the scriptures. Amos Funkelstein notes that medieval Christians believed God had made accommodations for the Israelites. For example, they recognize in the scriptures Christians are not called to perform animal sacrifices to God, but that the Israelites were. Whether true or not, the reasoning they employed was that God accommodated himself to the beliefs of ancient people, who believed this was necessary to appease demons pretending to be gods. The medieval belief was that the Creator permitted this in Israel until he could progress his people enough to realize this was not necessary. But if God could accommodate himself in this way, we can expect that he did it in other ways as well, like using the language of the day to teach theological facts without carrying scientific truth. In other words, the scriptures were not meant to be understood as stating scientific facts, but using the language of the common man of the ancient world. Medieval Jewish and Christian exegesis share the hermeneutical principle of accommodation, the assumption that the scriptures are adjusted to the capacity of mankind to receive and perceive them. But this meant medieval researchers were open to reinterpreting parts of scripture in metaphorical ways to accommodate what they found in science, and this idea came from seeing differences between the Old and New Testament. Some Christians developed the idea of the two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature, and both are meant to work together to reveal truth. Even one of Galileo's inquisitors, Cardinal Bellarmine, said if Galileo turned out to be right, it would only mean they would have to carefully reinterpret Scripture. The lack of strict literalism among Christians led to the idea that scientists could explore nature without worrying they would affect Christian dogma. Hutchings and Ungariano say, Christian dogma, rather than putting blinkers on thinkers, opened their minds to new possibilities. It was therefore a significant source of genuine and playful free thought about nature. Christian doctrines also came with new beliefs about humans that helped to foster science. Christians are called to love God because he first loved us. Those that do will naturally desire to learn more about him, and the Bible even says if we seek him, we will find him. But Paul said the invisible attributes of God are clearly seen in creation. It follows that for Christians, we can learn more about God by studying nature, which was a powerful motivation to do so. Margaret J. Osler said, "The Bible was a powerful source of teleological thinking. According to the Old Testament tradition, God created the world ex nihilo by his power and will. His wisdom and power are evident in the creation. A biblical verse frequently quoted by early modern natural philosophers proclaims the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork." The Bible also teaches that humans are made in God's image. Christians throughout the ages understood this to mean that our minds are similar to God's. Ancient pagans often rejected such a notion and believed the ways of the gods were beyond comprehension. The ancient Christian writer Celsus scolded Christians for this doctrine because he believed humans were like ants or bees compared to the gods. Therefore, how could we even begin to believe that we could discover the thoughts of God in what he created, given how inferior we are? Christians rejected this because of the doctrine of the Imago Dei, which elevated humanity to a much higher status. Johannes Kepler said, "For the theater of the world is so ordered that there exists in it suitable signs by which human minds, likenesses of God, are not only invited to study the divine works from which they may evaluate the founder's goodness, but are also assisted in inquiring more deeply." The physicist John Polkinghorne believes, if we are creatures made in the divine image, then it is entirely understandable that there is an order in the universe that is deeply accessible to our minds. In other words, because we are the Creator's image, we have the rational capacity to discover His laws. Toby E. Huff says, similar to the outstanding Lutheran theologian and educator Philip Melanchthon, Kepler believed in a close connection between God's created world, the structure of God's mind, and His created universe. Consequently, there was a homology between the human mind created by God and the structure of God's mind, so that human beings had the capacity to grasp the very nature of existence and God's laws. This medieval Christian belief has no analog in Islamic or Chinese philosophical thought. But we are not just the image of God, we also have a fallen nature. This Christian belief was especially helpful for science because it led to the scientific method. Ancient Greek philosophers lacked a rigorous method for experimentation. Instead, much of what they did was an attempt to postulate the most coherent theory of reality, while often failing to obtain empirical evidence for their theories. Christians believed our reasoning faculties were still good and useful, but marred. Therefore, one must do repeated experimentation to verify results. The scientific method comes out of this mentality. Noah J. Efron said, Augustine's notion of original sin, which held that Adam's fall left humans implacably damaged, was embraced by advocates of experimental natural philosophy. As they saw it, fallen humans lacked the grace to understand the workings of the world through cogitation alone, requiring in their disgraced state painstaking experiment and observation. In this way, Christian doctrine lent urgency to experiment. Peter Harrison said, in short, in order to recover the knowledge of nature lost as a consequence of the fall and to regain our dominion over natural things, we presently need special measures to overcome our fallen conditions. These are provided by the kind of experimental science practiced by the Royal Society. Christianity also developed the separation of church and state. It began with Jesus' words, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render unto God the things that are God's." This idea was developed more by Augustine in City of God, and came to fruition in the theology of the Protestant Reformation. This had important benefits for human rights and politics, but it also helped science, because Christians began to think of different domains of rule, like the state and the church. In the Islamic world, everything is to submit to the rule of Islam. The foreign sciences are useful, but only if they are subject to religious powers. Christianity rejects this idea and allows for a separation of powers, as well as fields of inquiry. Not everything is meant to be under the control of theologians. They are experts of religious matters, but not necessarily politics or science. Thus, science could develop into its own institution with its own subject matter experts, without being controlled by religious dogmas. This Christian concept of separation of church and state led to this development. Edward Grant says, positive feeling toward natural philosophy may inadvertently have been fostered by the Christian attitude toward the state, exemplified in Jesus' call to render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Although many Christian churchmen, such as St. Augustine, proclaim the superiority of the church over the state, the Christian church did acknowledge and accept the separation of church and state, which allowed for the development of a secularly oriented natural philosophy. In medieval Islam, by contrast, truly secular government was absent. The church and state were one. Grant also notes complicated Christian doctrines help science grow. It is hard for humans to understand things in Christianity, like how one God can be three persons, or how Jesus is fully God and fully man. To answer these questions, Christians had to explore old and new ideas in order to find ways for these doctrines to make sense. But this encouraged them to read Greek philosophy and study nature. So from a Christian perspective, God revealing things that require further study forced us to research to find more answers, which in turn led to more science. Grant says, to help explain such theological difficulties, scholars deemed the concepts and terminology of Greek metaphysics essential. Logic was also considered important. Islam was much less driven by inherent theological needs to seek out Greek philosophy than was Christianity, Indeed, Islamic theologians discouraged analyses of the Quran and prevented the development of a speculative theology. Latin Christianity provided a sympathetic environment for the sustenance and advance of natural philosophy and science. Christianity also removed old taboos that held science back in the pagan, Islamic, and Jewish world. Catherine Park notes, while the Greek and Roman avoidance of human dissection seems to have had its roots in the belief that corpses were ritually unclean, early Christian culture broke definitively with the idea of corpse pollution, embracing tombs as holy places and the bodies of the dead as objects of veneration, and potential sources of magical and healing power. This may sound anti-scientific, but it basically resulted in Christians not being afraid to go near dead bodies, which would later lead to more dissection of corpses and medical advances. In the medieval Islamic world, pigs were off limits, and dissecting bodies was forbidden. Because Christians had no religious aversion to pigs, many researchers in the Middle Ages first began to dissect them, and then human corpses. This allowed Christians to gain a better grasp of the way the body worked, which led to medical advances. Toby Huff notes the best depictions of human anatomy in the Islamic world were nothing compared to what we find coming out of Christian Europe. He also says, one can say that the Europeans, unlike Muslims, had in fact launched a program of empirical inquiry into the constitution of the human body, and part of that inquiry necessitated dissecting human bodies. Conversely, post-mortem examinations for forensic purposes in the Islamic world were said to be strictly forbidden, as they were in China for different reasons. Not only was there an aversion to dissecting pigs, as well as the human body, Islamic medical education of the time was devoted to the memorization of texts. James Hannam notes in the ancient world, working with your hands was considered low and dishonorable. The elites were not meant to get their hands dirty. This resulted in many trained philosophers not engaging in any type of work that would have been perceived as beneath their class, which meant they rarely conducted experiments, attempted to construct new inventions, or did anything that was considered manual labor. Within Christianity, the Son of God was a carpenter before his ministry. St. Paul was a tent maker. Working with your hands was not considered low or dishonorable in Christian thought, which freed scientific researchers to build, experiment, and explore nature. Where Roger Bacon was unusual was his interest in the work of craftsmen. Most medieval scholars had no time for technology and handicraft. This was partly a reflection of the views of Greek philosophers, like Plato and Aristotle, who thought that any kind of manual work was beneath the dignity of intellectuals. This is an area where Christianity provided a useful counter to pagan chauvinism. After all, Jesus himself had been a carpenter, but old prejudices were slow to die out, and most university-educated men did not involve themselves with trade. Over time, Christianity slowly allowed researchers the freedom and dignity to work with their hands, which led to more experimentation and empirical work. Finally, it is said that necessity is the mother of all inventions. The ancient Romans didn't invent much compared to what came out of the Middle Ages. One of the reasons is because the Romans relied heavily on slave labor. There is no reason to make advances in agriculture or water power technology if the elites have slaves to perform all the manual labor. But as we noted in prior videos, Christianity was crucial for establishing human rights and abolishing slavery. As these things were slowly being recognized in Christendom, slavery was becoming obsolete. The lack of slave labor meant humans had to come up with new technologies to replace what slaves were used for. Thus, Christianity indirectly created a necessity for technology because it gave more value to humanity. When we look at what comes out of Christianity, we see it provides so many necessary preconditions for modern science to form. The amount of ideas that science has borrowed from Christianity is staggering. Without Christian beliefs and doctrines, science would not have developed so quickly, if at all. As Hutchings and Ungariano say, for in actual fact, no other body of thought has ever been of greater benefit to scientific thinking than the central tenets of traditional Christianity have in the whole of human history. Seb Falk says, we have seen too that religion was no impediment to scientific progress. Time and again we have witnessed medieval Christians respecting and absorbing learning from other faiths without prejudice. Pious faith motivated investigation of the natural world. Institutions, from individual monasteries to the papal monarchy itself, instigated and supported science. Stephen Gaukroger said, "Indeed, a distinctive feature of the scientific revolution is that unlike other scientific programs and cultures, it is driven often explicitly by religious considerations. Christianity set the agenda for natural philosophy in many respects and projected it forward in a way quite different from that of any scientific culture." Noah J. Efron says, "One cannot recount the history of modern science without acknowledging the crucial importance of Christianity." The consensus of experts and the evidence could not be more clear. Christianity was crucial for the development of modern science. When we look at the technology we have today, as compared to what people in the ancient world had, it is an immeasurable difference. We are living in a utopia by comparison. But such a world could not have come about without modern science, and modern science was largely built on a foundation of Christian beliefs. Our medical advances, energy technology, smart devices, communication systems, agricultural technology, and other advances are largely contingent on what Christianity has given us. The data could not be more clear. No other ideology has been more beneficial for humanity than Christianity. If there was ever a dark ages, it was the time before Christianity saturated the world with its benefits. We have the Bible to thank for making our lives infinitely better and giving us the beliefs we needed to create modern science, and in turn, lift humanity out of a dark past. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.